The laundry basket sat like a white plastic barricade between me and a Tuesday gone wrong. My phone hissed on the counter. "Your kids don't fit the aesthetic," my sister said over the speaker. Lily dropped her drawing and cried. My husband, Julian, didn't yell. He just stared at Allison's husband, Brian, through the kitchen window. Then he calmly requested a full audit before anyone saw it coming. The Spider-Man sock in my hand felt heavy. Allison didn't realize the war had started. Julian stood by the glass with a stillness that usually cost people millions. He watched Brian pacing our driveway in a tailored suit that Julian's money had likely financed. The sunlight caught the sweat on Brian's upper lip. Julian didn't blink. He just pulled his phone from his pocket. The screen cast a cold blue light across his jaw. He typed a single name into his email. It was his chief legal officer. Brian waved at us. He still thought he was getting the check. The house grew unnervingly quiet as Lily's sobs faded into a hollow hiccup. She clutched a crayon until the wax snapped in her small palm. I wanted to reach out, but my limbs felt frozen by Allison's sharp words. Aesthetic. High caliber. Those labels were knives. I looked at the family portrait Lily had been coloring. She had crossed out her own face with a thick black line. My sister hadn't just uninvited us. She had told my daughter that she was invisible. Julian turned away from the window and caught my gaze. His eyes were dark and focused like a predator sensing a shift in the wind. He didn't ask if I was okay. He knew I wasn't. Instead, he tapped the screen of his phone one last time. Brian's expansion project is dead, he whispered. I felt a sudden chill. This wasn't just about a birthday party anymore. Julian had spent years ignoring Brian's sloppy books for the sake of peace. That peace was now a memory. By Wednesday, the air in our kitchen tasted like copper. Brian called 10 times before noon, but Julian let every vibration ring out into the silence. We sat at the table eating oatmeal, while the world outside began to crumble for my sister. A courier arrived at their mansion with a manila envelope. I imagined Allison's face when she saw the Northbridge Holdings seal. She loved that logo until it became a termination notice. The first report on Brian's fraud sat on our counter. The audit revealed 3 years of hidden debt and forged signatures. Brian had been using our name to bully vendors into silence. He thought family loyalty was a blank check for his arrogance. I looked at the phone and saw Allison was finally calling me instead of Julian. Her voice would be full of tears and fake apologies. I didn't pick up. I just watched Lily draw a new sun on a fresh page. Julian smiled. The trap was shut and the aesthetic was finally gone. The manila envelope sat on the granite island like a dormant explosive. I watched the steam rise from my coffee, while Julian stared at the fireplace. He hadn't slept. His shirt was crisp, but his eyes were bloodshot from a night spent reading spreadsheets. Allison is at the front gate, he said quietly. I checked the security monitor. Her black SUV was idling near our mailbox. She wasn't yelling anymore. She looked small against the iron bars. I opened the heavy front door, and the Colorado wind bit at my face. Allison stepped out of her car with a designer bag clutched to her chest. Her hair was perfect, but her skin looked gray. "Ava, please tell him to stop," she whispered. Her voice lacked its usual sharp edge. She looked past me at our quiet house. I didn't step aside to let her in. My sister was a stranger now. She had chosen her side. The audit found everything. "Allison," I said. My voice was steadier than I expected. She flinched as if I had struck her. She tried to reach for my hand, but I pulled back. The memory of Lily crying over that black ink drawing was still fresh in my mind. "It was just a birthday party," she pleaded. Her eyes searched mine for the old peacekeeper. She didn't find her. I felt a cold surge of finality in my chest. She started listing the people who would look down on her if the mansion went into foreclosure. She talked about the mayor and the academy board. Not once did she mention Lily or my son. Her world was still a collection of titles and optics. "We will lose the house," she cried. I looked at her polished nails and thought about the workers Brian hadn't paid. Julian appeared behind me. He held a thick stack of legal papers. Julian handed her a single sheet of paper from the pile. It wasn't a check or a reprieve. It was a formal list of the vendors Brian had defrauded over 18 months. "Pay them first," Julian said. His voice was like a closing cell door. Allison looked at the names of the local electricians and plumbers. She realized, then, that Julian wasn't just killing a deal. He was dismantling their entire social throne. Her hand began to shake. "You are destroying family," she hissed. Her desperation finally turned back into venom. She looked at me with pure hatred. "You were always the jealous one." Ava. I almost laughed at the absurdity of her claim. I had everything I needed right inside those walls. Julian put his hand on my shoulder and squeezed gently. He didn't need to say a word. The power had completely shifted. Allison was standing in the dirt while we held the keys. She turned and marched back to her car, without a final goodbye. The engine roared as she sped away from our gate. Julian looked at the empty driveway for a long moment. He didn't look triumphant. He looked exhausted by the weight of the truth. "There is more," he muttered. He pulled a second envelope from his jacket pocket. It was addressed to the state prosecutor. Brian hadn't just lied to us. He had stolen from the government. The cold morning air settled deep into my lungs as I stared at the second envelope. Julian did not move. He kept his eyes on the retreating dust from Allison's car. The prosecution file looked thin, but its weight felt massive. "He used our children's college fund accounts," Julian said. My heart skipped a heavy beat. He had opened the accounts using forged signatures last year. Brian had drained the trust for a failing high-rise project. I felt the kitchen walls closing in on my sanity. My objective was simple now. I had to protect our son and daughter from total financial ruin. I walked back inside and grabbed my laptop. The banking passwords were saved, but my hands shook too much to type. "How much is left?" I whispered. Julian joined me at the island. He looked at the screen with a grim face. The numbers were blinking in a mocking red. We saw the transaction history, scrolling down the bright screen. Brian had moved $60,000 just 2 days ago. That was the same day Allison called to insult our kids. The timing felt like a deliberate slap to my face. I realized then that their aesthetic was paid for with my children's future. It was not just a social snub. It was a calculated robbery. Julian tapped a key and a new window popped open. The bank records showed a series of strange wire transfers to an offshore shell company. Brian was not just failing. He was hiding the remaining cash before the inevitable collapse happened. He wanted to keep his luxury lifestyle while we suffered the loss. "He is fleeing," Julian noted. My husband called his private investigator. The pressure in the room surged. We had to freeze those assets before the sun set on this miserable Friday. A notification chimed on my phone. It was an automated alert from our daughter's school. Someone had tried to pick up Lily early without my permission. My blood turned to ice. Brian was desperate enough to use our children as leverage. I grabbed my car keys and sprinted for the garage. Julian was already on the phone with the local police. The situation had moved far beyond money. My sister's husband was truly dangerous. I drove through the suburbs with a focused rage. The elementary school sat at the end of a long cul-de-sac. I saw Brian's silver sedan idling near the playground fence. He looked frantic as he spoke to a young teacher through the mesh. I slammed my brakes and jumped out. He turned toward me with a wild look in his eyes. He held a small stuffed animal that belonged to Lily. He was trying to lure her. "Get away from her, Brian," I screamed. The teacher stepped back in confusion. Brian did not move. He looked at me with a jagged smile that did not reach his eyes. "I just wanted to say goodbye," he rasped. He dropped the toy into the dirt and backed away toward his car. I realized he was not trying to kidnap her. He was leaving a message. He wanted me to know he could always reach us. The silver sedan sped away, leaving a plume of gray exhaust near the swings. I snatched Lily from the teacher's side and held her tight. Her small heart hammered against my chest like a trapped bird. He said he had a surprise. She whispered into my neck. I didn't answer. I just marched her to the car and locked the doors. The school parking lot felt exposed. I saw a black SUV idling across the street. It was Allison. I drove toward the local police station with white knuckles. My only goal was a restraining order that would hold. The pressure mounted when my phone buzzed with a frantic text from Julian. Brian had just attempted to access our secondary home equity line. He was burning every bridge in a mad scramble for liquid cash. I realized then that the audit had triggered a total scorched earth response. Brian wasn't just hiding. He was actively trying to bankrupt us. The station lobby smelled of floor wax and stale coffee. I sat Lily on a plastic chair and approached the sergeant. My hands were finally steady. I explained the forged signatures and the unauthorized school visit. The officer looked at the stuffed toy I had recovered from the dirt. He nodded slowly and began typing a report. The power shifted when I handed him the banking documents Julian had sent. These were not just family squabbles. They were felonies. A detective emerged from the back office and gestured for me to follow him. He held a tablet showing a map of the city. They had been tracking Brian's phone since Julian called the state prosecutor. He just stopped at a private airfield. The detective said. My breath hitched. If he left the country, our children's money was gone forever. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. We were running out of time. I watched the map as a red dot pulsed near the outskirts of town. Julian arrived at the station, his suit jacket discarded and his tie loosened. He looked like a man ready for a final confrontation. He gripped my hand, his palm warm and dry. The accounts are frozen, he told me. Brian didn't know yet. He was sitting on a plane with empty pockets. We had won the financial war, but the emotional cost remained. Suddenly, the detective's tablet chirped with a loud, rhythmic alert. The red dot on the screen began to move rapidly toward the highway. Brian wasn't boarding a plane. He had spotted the unmarked police cruiser at the hangar. He was heading back toward the center of the suburbs. My phone rang in my pocket. It was Allison's number again. I answered it without thinking. I heard only the sound of heavy breathing and a distant siren. Ava. Help me? Allison choked out. Her voice was distorted by a sob. I heard a loud crash through the speaker. Then there was the unmistakable sound of metal grinding against metal. The line went dead before I could speak a word. Julian and I stared at each other in frozen horror. The red dot on the detective's screen stopped moving near the park. Brian had crashed into my sister's SUV in the middle of a chase. Julian grabbed my arm as we sprinted toward his car. The police station blurred behind us in a haze of blue light and urgency. My only goal was reaching that intersection before the sirens stopped. The detective yelled directions over the radio while I gripped the door handle. Fear tasted like cold iron in my throat. We drove through 3 red lights, with the tires screaming against the asphalt. I saw the smoke rising over the trees near the neighborhood park. The crash site was a graveyard of broken glass and twisted chrome. Allison's SUV was pinned against an ancient oak tree by the force of Brian's sedan. Fluids leaked onto the pavement in a shimmering, dangerous pool. I jumped out before Julian fully stopped the car. The smell of burning rubber filled my nose. Allison! I screamed into the chaos. I saw her hand pressed against the shattered side window. She was alive, but the door was jammed tight by the impact. Brian sat in his driver's seat, with his head resting on the deployed airbag. He looked like a broken doll in an expensive suit. He didn't move as the police began to surround the wreckage with drawn weapons. The power balance shifted when a young officer pulled him from the car and threw him onto the gravel. Brian didn't fight back. He just stared at the sky with empty eyes. He had lost everything in a single, desperate moment. I reached the SUV and peered through the spider-webbed glass at my sister. Her face was covered in small cuts, and her shoulder was pinned by the dashboard. She looked at me with a clarity I hadn't seen in years. "I tried to stop him," she whispered. Her voice was thin and brittle. She had seen him at the airfield and tried to block his path with her car. Allison had finally chosen family over her curated aesthetic. Julian used a heavy pry bar from a nearby fire truck to force the door open. The metal groaned and snapped like a dying beast. We pulled Allison out onto the grass, just as the first flames flickered under Brian's hood. She clutched my hand with a desperate, bruising strength. "Madison is safe," she managed to say before coughing. My sister had hidden her daughter at a friend's house before confronting Brian. She had finally acted like a mother. Paramedics swarmed us with stretchers and orange blankets. They worked with a quiet, efficient rhythm that signaled the gravity of the injuries. Julian stood back and watched the police lead Brian away in heavy iron shackles. The financial audit had triggered a physical collapse that no one could have predicted. My children's money was still gone, but my sister was breathing. The sun began to set behind the smoky horizon. We stood in the wreckage of our old lives. One medic pulled a small, leather-bound notebook from Allison's discarded purse. He handed it to me with a puzzled look. I opened the cover and saw rows of handwritten dates and dollar amounts. It wasn't a diary or a planner. It was a secret ledger Allison had kept for months. She had been documenting Brian's thefts long before the birthday party. She knew the truth and was waiting for someone to help her. My sister hadn't been an accomplice. She was a witness. The hospital lobby smelled of industrial lemon and fear. I clutched the secret ledger against my ribs like a shield. My objective was to hand this evidence to the lead detective before Brian's lawyers arrived. Julian stood by the sliding glass doors, his shadow long and jagged on the linoleum. We waited for news on Allison's surgery. Every chime of the elevator made me flinch. The pressure was a physical weight on my chest. Brian was being processed in the basement. A man in a navy suit approached us with a stiff gait. He was the district attorney's top investigator. I held out the leather notebook with shaking fingers. He flipped through the pages of handwritten crimes. His eyebrows shot up as he saw the dates. Allison had tracked every wire transfer since last spring. She had recorded the offshore accounts and the forged signatures in agonizing detail. The power shifted instantly. Brian wasn't just facing a civil suit. This was racketeering. The investigator looked at me with a new respect. He tapped a specific entry from June. "He used your company's credit line for his personal mortgage," he said. I felt the floor tilt beneath my feet. Julian moved closer, his face turning into a mask of stone. We hadn't just lost the college funds. Brian had compromised Julian's entire firm. The audit had only scratched the surface of the rot. My husband's empire was now under a legal microscope. Suddenly, a nurse emerged from the surgical wing. She was dabbing a red smudge from her forearm. My heart stopped. I thought of the crash and the oak tree. "She is stable," the nurse said softly. I leaned against Julian and exhaled a jagged breath. The immediate terror of death was gone, but the fallout was just beginning. Allison was awake and asking for me. She wanted to finish what she started. We walked toward the recovery rooms. The recovery ward was a maze of beeping monitors and pale curtains. Allison looked tiny in the middle of the white bed. Her shoulder was wrapped in thick bandages. She saw the ledger in my hand and nodded slowly. "I couldn't tell you before," she whispered. Her voice was a dry rasp. She had been terrified for Madison's safety for months. Brian had threatened to disappear with their daughter if Allison ever spoke up. Her silence was a cage. I pulled a chair to her bedside and sat down. Julian stood by the window, watching the police guards in the hallway. The tension in the room was thick and suffocating. "Why the party?" I asked. I needed to understand the insult that started this war. Allison closed her eyes. "He needed a distraction," she admitted. The high-caliber guests were potential marks for his next scam. She had tried to keep us away to protect our reputation. The realization hit me like a second impact. The aesthetic comment wasn't an insult. It was a desperate warning. She had played the villain to keep my children away from a crime scene. I looked at the bruises on her face and felt a wave of guilt. I had judged her for her pride while she was drowning in a nightmare. The power balance between us dissolved into raw empathy. We were just two sisters caught in a storm. The detective entered the room with a recording device. He needed Allison's formal statement to lock the case. Julian stepped outside to take a call from his board of directors. The pressure was mounting on his end to distance the firm from Brian. I stayed by the bed, holding Allison's hand. She began to speak, her voice gaining strength with every confession. She named the banks and the shell companies. She gave them everything they needed. As she finished, she looked at the door with a sudden flash of panic. "The beach house," she gasped. Brian had a second set of keys hidden in Madison's old backpack. He had mentioned a backup plan involving a locker in the Caymans. The detective paused the recording and stood up. He signaled to his partner in the hall. They realized Brian hadn't acted alone. He had a silent partner waiting in the shadows. The web was growing larger. I walked Julian to the elevator as the sun finally dipped below the horizon. We were exhausted, but the hunt wasn't over. He looked at his phone and showed me a blocked number. A text had arrived 10 minutes ago. It was a photo of our front door at home. Someone was watching our children while we were stuck at the hospital. The twist chilled my blood to the bone. Brian was in jail, but his partner was free. My breath hitched as I stared at the photo of our front porch. The target was simple. I had to reach my children before the shadows on that porch moved. Julian gripped his phone until his knuckles turned ivory. He didn't waste a second on words. We sprinted through the hospital exit, the sliding doors hissing like a warning behind us. The night air was thick with the scent of impending rain. We were 30 minutes away, if the traffic held its breath. The drive was a blur of neon lights and screeching brakes. Pressure surged when Julian's home security app flashed a second notification. A sensor in the backyard had been tripped. Someone was pacing the perimeter of our lives while we fought a war of spreadsheets. I called the sitter, but the line just rang into a hollow void. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. The silence on the other end felt like a physical blow. We were too late. We skidded into our driveway, the tires screaming against the cold asphalt. Julian jumped out before the engine died, his handgun gripped low against his thigh. The front door was slightly ajar, casting a thin sliver of yellow light onto the welcome mat. I followed him inside, my senses tuned to the creak of the floorboards. The house smelled of vanilla candles and something metallic. We found the sitter slumped on the sofa. She was alive but deeply unconscious. A single needle lay nearby. I raced upstairs to the nursery, my lungs burning with every jagged breath. The hallway felt miles long. I burst through the door and saw two small shapes, huddled under the blankets. Lily and Noah were safe. They were breathing deeply, lost in a forced sleep. My knees hit the carpet as I checked their pulses. They were steady. Julian stood in the doorway. his eyes scanning the shadows for a ghost. The power shifted when he noticed a small, black device hidden behind the lamp. It was a professional-grade transmitter, blinking with a steady, rhythmic pulse. This was not Brian's amateur work. The partner was someone with high-level technical skills and access to Julian's internal security codes. We weren't just being watched. We were being recorded. Julian smashed the device with the heel of his shoe. The plastic crunched like bone. We had protected the children, but the house felt like a cage. Someone knew every secret we kept. The silence was finally broken by a chime. My laptop on the desk flickered to life, without anyone touching the keys. A video file began to play. It was a live feed from Conference Room C at Julian's office. A hooded figure was sitting in Julian's leather chair, holding a stack of the audit papers. The figure looked up and waved at the camera. My stomach dropped. I recognized the gold signet ring on the person's right hand. It belonged to Julian's chief legal officer, Jennifer. She was the architect of the entire fraud. The screen went black as Jennifer's voice filled the room through the speakers. "You should have signed the contract, Julian," she whispered. Her tone was clinical and devoid of any remorse. She had used Brian as a convenient shield to drain the firm for years. The birthday party snub was her idea to test our reactions. She wanted to see if we were paying attention to the cracks in the foundation. Now she was finishing the job by erasing the evidence. Julian pulled me close as he dialed the police sergeant from the station. The pressure was absolute. Jennifer had the override codes for every digital account we owned. She could vanish our wealth with a single keystroke. We watched the nursery window as a dark van pulled away from the curb. The police were 5 minutes out. Jennifer was already 10 minutes ahead. We had the physical safety of our kids, but our future was evaporating in the digital cloud. "She has the Cayman's locker key," I whispered, remembering Allison's frantic warning. Julian nodded, his face a mask of calculated fury. He wasn't looking at the money anymore. He was looking at the toxicology report on the sitter's phone. Jennifer had crossed the line from theft to physical assault. That was the mistake that would end her. Julian opened his own hidden laptop. He had a secondary server that even Jennifer didn't know existed. The hunt turned into a digital pursuit. He tapped into the airfield's manifest and saw a private jet idling for a 2 a.m. departure. Jennifer's name wasn't on the list, but her tail number was. We saw the sirens flashing in the distance, blue and red painting the trees. The micro twist came when Julian's screen showed a third person involved in the transfer. It was my father. He had been funding Brian's losses to keep Allison's lifestyle afloat. The betrayal was complete. The entire family tree was rotting from the roots. The nursery felt like a cold tomb as the digital clock blinked midnight. My only goal was to secure the children before my father's betrayal could escalate further. Julian gripped the laptop with a terrifying focus. The screen showed the hidden server logs flashing in a steady rhythm. My father had been a silent partner in Brian's greed for years. He had signed the loan documents that put my daughter's future at risk. The family harmony I had protected was a hollow, expensive lie. I looked at the sleeping children and realized that my father had sacrificed them for Allison's status. The pressure in my chest made it hard to draw a full breath. Julian's hands flew across the keyboard as he initiated a global freeze on all associated accounts. He was dismantling his own father-in-law's estate with a surgical precision. We were no longer just a family in crisis. We were a legal execution squad. Julian paused when a new signal pulsed on the map. The power balance shifted when Jennifer's private jet failed its pre-flight clearance at the airfield. Julian had blocked the tail number using a high-level corporate override code. We saw her black sedan idling on the tarmac through the live satellite feed. She wasn't alone in the car. My father was sitting in the passenger seat with a briefcase on his lap. He looked tired and old in the grainy footage. They were trapped by the very gates they had once owned. The sirens grew louder as a phalanx of cruisers surrounded the airfield perimeter. I watched my father exit the vehicle with his hands raised in the harsh light. Jennifer tried to run, but the police dog tackled her onto the cold asphalt. The audit had successfully triggered a total systemic collapse. My sister's aesthetic had finally led to my father's handcuffs. I felt no joy in the sight. I only felt a deep, chilling sense of finality. We drove to the hospital one last time, as the sun began to rise over Denver. Allison was sitting up in bed, her eyes red from a long night of truth. She already knew about our father's arrest from the news. We didn't need to explain the missing money or the offshore lies. She reached out and touched my arm with a bandaged hand. "It is over," she whispered. I nodded and felt the weight of 30 years finally lift. The truth had replaced the lie of a perfect family. I walked to the window and saw Lily playing with a toy in the hallway. She looked happy and safe in the morning light. Julian stood beside me, his hand resting on the small of my back. We had lost the fortune, but we had found our souls. I realized that true beauty wasn't an aesthetic. It was the strength to draw a line in the dirt. The kids were finally home.